When I think back to my childhood, the word that comes to mind isn't warmth, or laughter, or even family. It's silence. A kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but heavy. The silence of being ignored. The silence of being present, but unseen. I was the middle child in a house where attention was a rare currency. And for reasons I never truly understood, my share of that currency was nearly non-existent. My parents weren't cruel in the loud, obvious ways that you sometimes hear about in stories. There were no shouting matches directed at me, no punishments that left scars on the skin. Instead, there was something far subtler, and in many ways, far more painful. It was the constant overlooking, the consistent dismissal, the subtle but unmistakable message that my presence was less valuable than that of my siblings. My older brother, Adam, was the golden child. Tall, athletic, the one who could charm relatives at family gatherings with his easy confidence. He was the one my father spoke proudly about to his friends. Football tournaments, academic medals, even the way he carried himself. Everything about him was treated as though it were proof of my father's greatness as a parent. My mother, too, adored him, though in her quieter way. She fussed over him, made sure his favorite dishes were prepared, and never seemed to tire of telling neighbors how brilliant he was. Then there was my younger sister, Lily. She was delicate, artistic, and endlessly coddled. My parents treated her like a fragile gem that needed to be polished and protected at all costs. Any mistake she made was brushed off with indulgent laughter. "She's just young," my mother would say, or, "She has a gentle soul." It didn't matter what it was. Lily's tears could melt even my father's sternest moods. And then there was me, the one in the middle. Not the first, not the youngest. Just there. I remember birthdays where Adam got a new bicycle and Lily received an elaborate dollhouse, while I got something last minute, something that felt like an afterthought. Sometimes it wasn't even wrapped, just handed to me as though I should be grateful I got anything at all. I remember dinners where I would try to share something from my day, a test I did well on, a drawing I was proud of, and my words would be brushed aside because Adam had something more important to say, or Lily had spilled her drink and needed comfort. At first, as a child, I tried harder. I thought maybe if I studied more, helped out around the house, kept quiet when they needed quiet, spoke up when they wanted conversation, maybe then they would notice me. I would bring home perfect grades, not a single mistake on a math test, and lay it out on the kitchen table hoping for some praise. The response was usually muted, a distracted, "That's nice," before they moved on to asking Adam about his football game, or Lily about her art project. The message was clear. No matter what I did, it wasn't enough to pull their gaze toward me. As I got older, I learned to stop trying so hard. I withdrew quietly, because it hurt less than being ignored after I had put my heart into something. I started spending long hours alone in my room, reading whatever books I could get my hands on, journaling about the things I didn't dare say out loud, and slowly building a world of my own where I mattered. I didn't fight for their attention anymore. I let them overlook me, let them underestimate me, because at some point, it stopped feeling like something I could change. But deep inside, I carried a quiet seed. A seed of determination. I didn't think of it as revenge back then, not in the way people usually imagine revenge. There was no plan to hurt them, or to prove them wrong in dramatic, explosive ways. It was subtler, calmer, almost invisible. It was the determination that one day I would not need their approval. One day, I would stand on my own, and they would have no choice but to see me. High school was when I started to realize just how invisible I had become in my own home. Adam was preparing for college, and all the family resources were funneled into making sure he had every opportunity. Test prep classes, sports equipment, even a new laptop. My parents would beam with pride at his achievements, proudly posting photos of him online. Lily, too, had her world carefully curated by my mother. Art classes, supplies, trips to museums. I asked once if I could join a writing workshop. Writing had become my escape, the way I poured out the emotions I couldn't voice. The answer I got was a flat no. "We don't have the budget for that," my father said, without hesitation. That same week, I watched as he spent hundreds of dollars on Adam's new sports gear. It wasn't about money, it was about priorities, and I simply wasn't one of them. I didn't argue. I didn't shout or cry. I just went to my room, opened my old notebook, and kept writing. That was when my perspective began to shift. If no one was going to notice me in this house, then I would create a life outside of it. Slowly, silently, I began working on myself. I saved whatever little allowance I received, buying secondhand books on writing, self-study guides, even old magazines to analyze how articles were structured. I borrowed books from the library endlessly, devouring everything from fiction to biographies to psychology. My parents never noticed the growing stack of notebooks filled with stories, essays, and ideas. They never asked what I was doing in my room late at night, light spilling from under the door. In some ways, that was their biggest mistake, ignoring me so completely that I had the freedom to grow unnoticed. By the time I graduated high school, I had built a quiet but strong foundation. I didn't get the same kind of financial support for college that Adam did, of course. He went to a prestigious university out of state, with my parents proudly footing the bill. For me, the conversation was different. "We can't afford to send you away," they said. It wouldn't make sense. "Why don't you just go to the local community college?" So that's what I did. I enrolled in community college, working part-time jobs to cover what little wasn't paid. I waitressed. I tutored younger students. I worked long shifts at the campus library. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me something Adam and Lily never had: resilience. While they were cushioned and supported, I learned to balance work, school, and my dreams. I learned to push myself, not for their approval, but for mine. And yet, the pattern remained. Family dinners were still filled with stories about Adam's internships and Lily's growing art portfolio. My accomplishments, a scholarship I earned, an essay that got published in the student journal, barely registered. At best, I got polite nods. At worst, complete silence. But here's the thing. The silence no longer hurt the way it once did. Instead, it fueled me. Every dismissal became a reason to push harder. Every overlooked success became a private victory I stored deep inside, a quiet reminder that my worth was not defined by their inability to see it. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. But little by little, I carved my own path. Professors began to notice my work. I was offered opportunities to publish in small literary magazines. I started freelancing, writing articles for online platforms. By the time I transferred from community college to a state university, I had not only paid my own way, but also built a portfolio that was steadily opening doors. Meanwhile, at home, nothing had changed. I was still the quiet, invisible daughter. At family gatherings, relatives asked about Adam's career or Lily's art exhibitions. No one asked me about my work. My parents never once introduced me as our daughter, the writer. It was always just, "This is Anna." Plain, unadorned, forgettable. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore, because by then I understood something they didn't. Being ignored had given me a strange kind of power. While they were busy putting all their energy into Adam and Lily, I was quietly building something lasting, and one day I knew they would realize it. Not because I shouted it in their faces, not because I demanded recognition, but because success has a way of speaking for itself. That was the beginning of my calm revenge. A revenge not of words, not of confrontation, but of persistence, of growth, of becoming someone they could no longer overlook, no matter how hard they tried. And though they didn't know it yet, that day was closer than they imagined. When I look back on the years that followed my transfer to the state university, I often think of them as the years of quiet building. There was nothing glamorous about them, no dramatic breakthroughs that you could point to and say, "That was the moment everything changed." Instead, it was a series of small, deliberate steps. Each one seemed ordinary on its own, but together, they built the foundation of a life that was entirely mine. University was both liberating and exhausting. On one hand, I was surrounded by people who didn't carry the same blind spots as my family. Professors who read my essays and encouraged me to pursue writing more seriously. Classmates who admired my ability to explain complex ideas clearly. Who asked me for help editing their work. Who treated me as though I had something worth offering. For the first time in my life, I felt seen by people outside my own home. But at the same time, it was grueling. Between classes, work, and late nights of writing, I often felt stretched thin. I didn't have the financial safety net my siblings enjoyed, which meant every expense was calculated carefully. While Adam drove a car my father had bought for him, I took the bus across town to get to work. While Lily had her art supplies provided without question, I bought my notebooks in bulk on sale, using pens until the ink ran completely dry. And yet, I didn't resent it. Somewhere along the way, I realized that every sacrifice I made, every dollar I earned for myself, was shaping me into someone stronger. My independence was not a burden. It was my greatest asset. It was during these years that I started to take my writing more seriously as a possible career rather than just a passion. I began pitching to online publications, most of which paid very little or nothing at all. But I saw each byline as an investment, a small brick in the wall I was building. Some articles were about lifestyle, others about literature, a few even about social issues. Each time I saw my name under a headline, I felt a quiet surge of pride. Of course, at home, none of this mattered. I would return for holidays or family dinners, and the pattern remained unchanged. Adam's progress in his business degree was the centerpiece of every conversation. Lily's art exhibitions, even the small local ones, were celebrated with excitement. My own achievements, publications, scholarships, academic recognition, were met with silence or a casual nod before the conversation shifted away. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular. I had just received an email a week earlier, informing me that one of my essays had been accepted by a reputable national magazine. For a young writer, it was an enormous deal. I had wanted so badly to share it with my family, even though I knew better by then. So during dinner, I cautiously mentioned it. "One of my essays is going to be published in the Atlantic Review," I said, my voice steady but with a tiny tremor of excitement underneath. There was a pause. My mother, carving the turkey, glanced at me briefly and said, "That's nice, dear." And then my father turned to Adam and asked, "So, how's that internship going?" That was it. The entire acknowledgement of my biggest success so far was a distracted, offhand, "That's nice." It stung, of course. I won't pretend it didn't. But rather than letting it break me, I quietly tucked the pain away and reminded myself of something I had begun to believe deeply. My success was not for them. It wasn't about finally earning their praise. It was about proving to myself that I could build a life without it. And so, I kept going. The years passed. I graduated with honors, having supported myself almost entirely. Adam went on to a corporate job with a starting salary that my father bragged about to anyone who would listen. Lily, still the darling of the family, secured a small gallery show for her paintings, which my mother proudly announced on social media. My own graduation? My parents showed up, yes, but there were no elaborate celebrations, no long speeches about how proud they were. It was treated like a small footnote, something expected rather than remarkable. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that my quiet persistence was beginning to open doors they couldn't have imagined. After graduation, I secured a job as a junior editor at a mid-sized publishing house. The pay wasn't glamorous, but it gave me two priceless things: stability and access. I was surrounded by books, by writers, by conversations about stories and ideas. In the evenings, I continued writing my own work, short stories, essays, even the beginnings of what I dreamed might one day become a book. Meanwhile, at home, the distance between me and my family grew wider, though they hardly seemed to notice. Visits became less frequent. Phone calls were shorter. I learned to keep my life separate from theirs, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Why share my victories with people who would only treat them as trivial? One winter, I received an offer that changed everything. A small publishing imprint wanted to compile a collection of essays on modern womanhood, and they asked me to contribute. The piece I wrote was deeply personal, touching on the experience of being overlooked, of finding strength in solitude. It resonated with readers in ways I hadn't anticipated. Reviews called it honest, raw, and quietly powerful. Suddenly, emails began arriving in my inbox from editors who wanted to know if I had more to share. For the first time, I felt the beginnings of recognition beyond the small circle of people who had supported me. Strangers were seeing me, valuing my words, and slowly, I began to realize that perhaps the world outside my family could give me the validation I had craved for so long. But of course, my family remained the same. That spring, when the collection was published and sold surprisingly well, I brought a copy home during Easter dinner. I placed it on the table, not with arrogance, but with quiet pride. "This is the book I contributed to," I said. My father glanced at it briefly, then turned away. My mother offered a polite smile. "That's good, dear." And then the conversation shifted back to Adam's promotion at work. It was in that moment that I stopped expecting anything more from them. Truly, finally, I let go of the hope that one day they would see me for who I was becoming. And with that release came a strange kind of freedom. I realized that my revenge, if you could even call it that, was not about rubbing my success in their faces. It was about living a life so rich and fulfilling that their silence no longer mattered. Over the next few years, my career grew steadily. I climbed the ranks at the publishing house, moving from junior editor to senior editor, eventually overseeing entire projects. I published more essays, some of which were picked up by major outlets. I began to receive invitations to speak at conferences, to share my insights on storytelling and resilience. Each milestone felt like another quiet stone added to the tower I was building, a tower they couldn't see but that stood tall nonetheless. And slowly, people in their circles began to notice. An old family friend once mentioned to my parents that they had read one of my essays and found it moving. Another relative congratulated me at a wedding for my growing career. Each time I saw the flicker of surprise on my parents' faces. They hadn't been paying attention, and now the outside world was telling them what they had missed. I never gloated. I never said, "I told you so." I simply smiled, thanked the people who noticed, and carried on. That was the essence of my calm revenge. I didn't need to say a word. The real turning point came when I began working on my first full-length book. It was a daunting task, one that stretched me to my limits, but I poured myself into it, writing late into the night, balancing deadlines with my full-time job, editing and re-editing until the words felt right. The book wasn't just a collection of essays, it was my story, woven into broader themes of resilience, identity, and self-worth. When it was finally published, I didn't rush to tell my family. I knew better than to expect a different reaction. Instead, I focused on the readers, and to my amazement, the book found an audience. Slowly at first, then more steadily. Reviews came in, interviews were requested, invitations to panels and events followed. It was a quiet but undeniable success. And little by little, word began to reach my family anyway. Friends of theirs mentioned seeing me on a podcast. A distant cousin posted about my book on social media. Neighbors congratulated them in passing. Each time I imagine it must have caught them off guard. For years they had overlooked me, dismissed me, ignored me. And yet here I was, being seen by the world in ways they could no longer deny. I didn't confront them. I didn't demand recognition. I simply continued. Because by then, I had realized something important. My revenge didn't need to be loud to be powerful. It only needed to be steady, undeniable, and real. And while they still hadn't admitted it to me directly, I knew, deep down, I knew, that they were beginning to see what they had missed all along. By the time my first book had been on shelves for a year, I began to notice how much had changed in my life, though not always in obvious ways. My name was no longer just a line on essays scattered across small magazines or online columns. It had become recognizable in certain circles, book clubs, literary forums, classrooms where professors assigned my work. There were readers who wrote to me, strangers whose lives I had touched without ever meeting them. And yet, when I visited home, the air was still heavy with the same silence. My parents had grown older by then, though their habits had not changed. Adam was now deep into his corporate career, earning bonuses and climbing steadily. Lily had become a local name in the art world, with a few galleries displaying her work. Their successes remained the centerpiece of family conversations. Mine, though impossible to ignore entirely anymore, was still treated as though it were secondary. But what made those years different was my own perspective. Their silence no longer wounded me in the way it once had. I had built a life where validation came from countless other places. Readers who quoted my work, colleagues who respected me, invitations that arrived from people who valued what I had to say. I no longer needed their recognition to believe in my worth. And that shift, I think, was the heart of my revenge. It was calm because I never sought to destroy or humiliate them. It was powerful because I no longer needed them to acknowledge me. I had outgrown the cage of invisibility they had placed me in, and in doing so, I had created a life that thrived without their approval. Still, there were moments when the irony of it all surfaced. Like the time a neighbor, who had apparently read my book, stopped my mother at the market to say how much they admired her daughter's writing. My mother, caught off guard, later mentioned it at dinner with the faintest edge of pride, though it was delivered almost reluctantly, as though acknowledging me too openly might upset the balance of favoritism that had defined our family for so long. Or the time Adam's colleague recognized me at a company event, telling him he had read my work in a professional journal. Adam looked surprised, almost unsettled, as though he had to reconcile the sister he had always seen as invisible with the writer whose name was known in his professional circles. Those were quiet victories, small moments where I said nothing, but the silence between us said everything. As the years moved forward, my career continued to grow. A second book followed, and then a third, each one built upon the last, exploring themes of resilience, identity, and the quiet strength of those who are overlooked. Readers told me they found pieces of themselves in my words, and that more than anything, felt like the highest success I could hope for. Eventually, speaking engagements became a regular part of my life. I stood on stages in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, sharing my story in measured, thoughtful tones. And though I never named my family directly, those who listened often understood the heart of it, the pain of being unseen, and the power of quietly carving your own place in the world anyway. It was at one of those events, years later, that my parents finally came face to face with what I had become. The event was a regional book festival, held not too far from the town where they still lived. I had been invited as one of the keynote speakers. It wasn't unusual for me by then, but this one carried a particular weight because it was so close to home. Word of it spread quickly, and many local faces I recognized from my childhood were in attendance. When I stepped onto the stage that day, I spotted them in the audience. My parents, sitting stiffly near the back, their expressions unreadable. I hadn't invited them. I hadn't told them about it at all. They must have come because someone else had mentioned it. Perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a family friend. I didn't change my speech for them. I spoke the way I always did, calmly, deliberately, weaving my own experiences into broader reflections. I talked about the weight of silence, about the strength that comes from building yourself without applause, about the quiet kind of revenge that doesn't shout, but simply endures until it can no longer be ignored. I didn't look at them directly. I didn't need to. When the audience rose at the end, clapping warmly, I stood there not with triumph, but with peace. Afterward, there was a book signing. A long line of readers formed, each waiting for a few words and a signature. My parents didn't come forward. They lingered at the back, watching, perhaps stunned at the sight of so many people eager to meet the daughter they had overlooked. When the line dwindled and the crowd dispersed, they approached me slowly. My mother spoke first. "You've done well," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. My father nodded but said nothing. There was no grand apology, no sudden outpouring of regret. Just those few words and the heavy silence around them. But that was enough. Not because I needed it, I didn't. By then, I had lived too long without their recognition to crave it. But because it confirmed what I had known for years, my calm revenge had worked. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded their attention. I had simply built a life they could no longer deny. In the months that followed, I noticed small changes. My mother mentioned my work in conversations more often. My father, though still reserved, occasionally asked about my projects. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was something. And for me, that was more than enough. Because the truth is, the real revenge was never about changing them. It was about changing myself, about refusing to let their silence define me, about proving, to myself first and foremost, that I could succeed without their applause. Even now, when I think back to that little girl sitting at the dinner table, trying to get her parents to notice her. I wish I could tell her something. You won't always be invisible. You'll find your place, not because they finally turn their eyes toward you, but because you'll build something so strong, so undeniable, that the world itself will see you. And when they finally do notice, it won't matter nearly as much as you thought it would. That is the essence of calm revenge. It isn't about shouting. It isn't about grand confrontations or dramatic gestures. It's about living your life so fully, so authentically, that those who once overlooked you can no longer pretend you don't exist. My story isn't unique. There are so many people who grow up unseen, underestimated, dismissed. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Being ignored can be its own kind of gift. It gives you room to grow in directions no one expects. It forces you to find validation from within, to build resilience, to quietly sharpen your skills until the day comes when the silence around you breaks. Not because you begged for attention, but because your success speaks for itself. And when that day comes, you don't need to gloat. You don't need to confront. You just keep moving forward, calm and steady, because that is the sweetest revenge of all. So if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever sat in a room full of people who couldn't see you for who you are, know this: you are not alone. And your silence, your invisibility, does not mean you lack worth. It simply means you are still building. And one day, when your work, your talent, your strength shines so brightly that the world notices, those who ignored you will too. Quietly, reluctantly, perhaps even uncomfortably, but they will. And by then, you won't need their recognition at all. That was my story. A story of the ignored daughter who became successful, not by shouting, not by demanding, but by living fully, persistently, and calmly until the silence could no longer contain me. If this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to join me in this space. Like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge for more stories like this, stories of quiet strength, of resilience, of revenge that doesn't need to scream to be heard. Because sometimes, the calmest stories are the most powerful.